The sun beats down mercilessly on the red dirt track that winds through the eucalyptus scrubland of Cape York Peninsula. 25 kilometres south of Cooktown, the landscape suddenly changes. Where lush tropical vegetation should continue, instead rises a dark anomaly. A massive heap of black granite boulders, stacked like the building blocks of some ancient, malevolent giant. This is Kalkajaka, and even from a distance, it commands respect. The enormous stones, some the size of houses, absorb the tropical heat without reflection, creating an island of darkness in the surrounding area. Between those boulders lie countless passages, caves and chambers, a three-dimensional maze that has swallowed the unwary for generations. It was July 1872 when Charles Grayner first followed his horse's tracks towards those forbidding granite walls. A practical man, a courier who knew the dangers of this frontier country. He tied his remaining horse to a sturdy tree and continued on foot, following hoofprints into the mountain's heart. He was never seen again. The searchers who came after found his horse, still tied where he'd left it, but of Grayner himself, absolutely nothing. No trace, no sign of struggle, no indication of what had befallen him. The tracks simply stopped, as if he'd vanished into the air itself. And he wouldn't be the last. Welcome to Strewth, a podcast where we venture into Australia's most baffling mysteries and explore the thin line between folklore and fact. For newcomers to the show, Strewth is what you mutter when reality takes such a sharp left turn that you need to invoke divine authority just to process it. It's a contracted version of God's truth, what Australians say when we're about to tell you something so extraordinary that we feel compelled to swear on its authenticity before we even begin. Because in this ancient land, the line between the possible and impossible has always been delicately drawn. I'm your host, and today we're exploring the place that the Kuku Yalanji people have called Kalkajaka for 40,000 years, the place of the spear. Europeans would later rename it Black Mountain, an equally ominous moniker, and over the past 150 years it's earned a reputation as Australia's own Bermuda Triangle. A geological oddity where men, horses and cattle have vanished without trace, where search parties themselves have disappeared, and where the very rocks seem to hunger for the living. The Kuku Yalanji people who have lived in this region since time immemorial understood something fundamental about this place. They called it the place of the spear, and they kept their distance. Their stories explain not just what the mountain was, but how it came to be. As one traditional owner tells it on a series made for the ABC, the story passed down from grandfather to grandson speaks of two giant brothers who were both in love with the same woman. In their rivalry, they made piles of stones, the granite boulders that are there today, and when they each threw rocks at one another, they killed each other, and their pile of stones remain as a monument to that ancient tragedy. But there are deeper Dreamtime stories too, of battles between black and white cockatoos, symbols representing different clan groups, the white cockatoo of the coastal plains and the black cockatoo of the inland clans. They fought over hunting land, and many people died. Their bones, the traditional owners say, remain in those mountains still. This site holds the same significance to them as the beaches of Gallipoli, a place where ancestors fell and where their spirits linger. This knowledge was passed down from generation to generation, from great-grandmother to granddaughter to daughter, with absolute clarity. This is sacred country. No one is allowed to go to that site. If they do, they'll get very sick. They say it touches the soul. These were not just casual warnings born of folklore. They were survival knowledge, spiritual knowledge, earned through thousands of years of understanding what happened to those who ignored them. The early European settlers arriving in the area in the 1870s with their confident colonial certainty dismissed such warnings as primitive superstition. They would learn, to their profound cost, that some indigenous wisdom transcends cultural boundaries. The year was 1872, and the Palmer River goldfields had drawn thousands of fortune seekers to Far North Queensland. Among them was Charles Grayner, a practical man who had abandoned dreams of striking it rich for the steadier work of carrying mail and supplies between the scattered settlements that dotted this harsh frontier. It was July when Grayner set out from Cooktown on what should have been a routine journey. Somewhere along the track that skirted the base of the Black Granite Mountain, he noticed one of his pack horses had wandered off, probably seeking water or better grazing. The animal's hoofprints led directly towards the forbidding pile of dark boulders that the local Aboriginal people avoided. Any experienced bushman knows that losing a horse in this country could mean the difference between life and death. Grayner had little choice but to follow the tracks, leading his remaining horse towards the mountain's edge. According to the few witnesses who saw him that day, Grayner appeared confident and well prepared. He carried water, provisions, and a rifle. He was known as a capable horseman and navigator, not given to panic or poor judgment. Local Aboriginal guides reportedly warned him against entering the boulder field, but like many colonists of his era, Grayner dismissed their concerns. The tracks from his missing horse led into a narrow passage between towering granite walls. Grayner tied his remaining horse to a sturdy tree and continued on foot, following the hoofprints into the heart of the mountain. He was never seen again. When Grayner failed to arrive at his destination, search parties were organised. Dozens of men, including experienced trackers, both Aboriginal and European, combed the area around the mountain. They found his horse, still tied where he'd left it, but of Grayner himself, nothing. No trace, no sign of struggle, no indication of what had befallen him. The searchers ventured into the same passage Grayner had taken, following his boot prints until they stopped, as if he'd vanished into the air itself. For weeks, the search continued. The boulder maze was systematically explored, at least to the extent that men could safely navigate its treacherous passages. They called his name, fired shots into the air, hoping to hear a response, searched every accessible cave and chamber. Grayner had simply ceased to exist. The colonial authorities recorded his disappearance in their official reports with characteristic bureaucratic restraint. Charles Grayner, courier, presumed deceased, body not recovered. But among the settlers and prospectors of the region, Grayner's fate had become something altogether more ominous. The first documented proof that the Black Mountain did indeed keep what entered its shadow. Ten years passed. The Palmer River goldfields had largely played out, but the Cooktown remained a bustling frontier town, servicing the cattlemen and selectors who were slowly taming the Cape York Peninsula. The story of Charles Grayner's disappearance had become local legend, told around campfires and in pub conversations, as a cautionary tale about the dangers of the outback. Then, on a sweltering November day in 1882, history repeated itself with a precision that would chill even the most rational observer. Harry Owens was a local settler, a man who had successfully established a small cattle run on the challenging country inland from Cooktown. Like Grayner before him, he was known for his bushcraft and practical nature. He was not a man given to flights of fancy or reckless behaviour. On that November morning, Owens set out from his homestead to search for several head of cattle that had strayed from his property. The tracks led, inevitably, towards the base of the Black Mountain. Unlike Grayner, Owens knew the stories, he understood the risks, but cattle were the foundation of his livelihood, and a few missing head could mean the difference between profit and loss in the marginal economics of frontier life. Owens was seen by a neighbouring selector approaching the mountain in the early afternoon, following the cattle tracks towards a boulder field. He carried a stock whip, provisions for several days, and led a spare horse in case he needed to drive the cattle home. When Owens failed to return that evening, his wife raised the alarm. By the following morning, a search party had assembled, many of the same men who had looked for Grayner, in almost exactly the same circumstances. Pursuing missing livestock on the same dark pile of granite boulders, Harry Owens too had simply vanished. And even the most sceptical began to wonder. If the disappearance of Harry Owens had unsettled the community around Cooktown, what happened just 1 month later sent ripples of genuine fear throughout the region. George Hawkins, like our two missing men before him, was a practical man. He was a neighbour of the missing Harry Owens who had participated in the search for his friend. He knew all too well the mountain's reputation, had seen firsthand how completely a man could disappear in its boulder maze. Yet in December 1882, when several of his own horses went missing, and their tracks led towards the black granite formation, Hawkins faced the same impossible choice that had confronted both Grayner and Owens. People out here couldn't simply ride off horses because of stories and superstitions, no matter how compelling those stories might be. Hawkins prepared more carefully than his predecessors. He informed multiple neighbours of his intentions, described exactly which route he planned to take, and arranged for a check on his welfare if he failed to return by a specified time. He carried extra provisions, water and ammunition. Most importantly, he brought rope, lengths of strong hemp line that he planned to use to mark his path through the boulder maze. On a scorching December morning, George Hawkins rode toward the mountain, leading a pack horse and carrying equipment that should have been sufficient to ensure his safe return. George Hawkins never came back. The search for Hawkins was the most extensive yet mounted. Nearly 50 men participated, including police from Cooktown and Aboriginal trackers from multiple tribal groups. They found his horses, like the others, grazing calmly in the valleys beyond the mountain. They found his pack horse, its load intact, near a small waterhole. But most disturbing of all, they found his rope. Lengths of hemp line were discovered throughout the boulder maze, tied to rocks and bushes exactly as Hawkins had planned. The rope trail led deep into the mountain's interior, winding through narrow passages and chambers, making a path that any competent bushman should have been able to follow back to safety. And then the rope simply ended. In a small chamber, perhaps 200 metres from the surface, the line was tied securely to a granite outcropping. Beyond that point, no trace of George Hawkins existed. The search party stood in that chamber, following the rope that should have led them to Hawkins, and found nothing. No sign of struggle, no blood, no scattered belongings. The man had simply ceased to exist at the precise point where his safety line ended. For the first time, even the most rational members of the search party began to whisper about supernatural explanations. How else could a careful, well-prepared man simply vanish at the end of his own safety rope? By the 1890s, the Black Mountain had acquired a reputation that extended far beyond the local district. Newspapers in Brisbane and Sydney carried stories about the mysterious disappearances, often embellished with speculation about supernatural forces and ancient curses. The mountain began to attract a curious type of visitor, those drawn by the very danger that had claimed previous travellers. Not all of these adventurers vanished. Some returned with tales that added to the mountain's growing mythology and mystique. They spoke of voices calling from deep within the boulder maze, of chambers where the temperature dropped suddenly despite the tropical heat, of a silence so complete it seemed to press against the eardrums like a physical force. Most disturbing and perhaps most compelling were the reports of disorientation. Experienced bushmen, Men who could navigate by stars and read the landscape like a book described becoming lost within metres of the mountain's edge. Passages they had entered minutes before seemed to have vanished. Chambers they had marked with cans or blazes appeared in entirely different locations when they tried to retrace their steps. The mountain, it seemed, did not simply swallow the unlucky, it actively confused and misled those who dared to explore its depths. By 1928, another documented disappearance added to the mountain's grim tally. Kalkajaka, a prospector drawn by rumours of gold and gemstones in the granite formations, vanished while exploring the boulder maze. Unlike the earlier cases, Packer's fate was eventually discovered. His body was found weeks later with a bullet wound to the head. The authorities recorded it as suicide, but questions lingered. What had driven an experienced prospector to take his own life deep within the mountain? What had he seen or experienced in those dark passages that made death preferable to continuing his exploration? 4 years later, in 1932, an unnamed traveller was found dead in similar circumstances. Discovered within the boulder maze under explained conditions that the colonial authorities seemed reluctant to investigate too thoroughly. A pattern was emerging. The mountain did not merely claim lives through accident or misadventure. It seemed to drive men to madness, to despair, to actions that their friends and families found incomprehensible. For more than a century, the Black Mountain held its secrets tightly. The stories of mysterious disappearances passed into local folklore, attracting sensation seekers and spawning increasingly elaborate theories about supernatural forces, magnetic anomalies, and even extraterrestrial activity. Then in 2022, a historian named Bev Shay began a systematic investigation into the documented disappearances. Armed with modern research tools and access to archives that had been scattered across multiple institutions, Shay set out to separate fact from fiction in the Black Mountain legend. What she discovered painted a compelling picture, though whether it fully explains the mountain's mysteries remains an open question. The Cape York Peninsula in the late 19th century was a frontier region of extraordinary harshness and isolation. Communication was sporadic, search and rescue capabilities were primitive, and the landscape itself was actively hostile to human survival. The nearest doctor was often hundreds of kilometres away. A broken leg could mean death. A snake bite was usually fatal. Crocodiles patrolled the waterways, and the tropical heat could kill through dehydration in a matter of hours. Most significantly, the region attracted a disproportionate number of men fleeing their pasts. Escaped convicts, failed prospectors, settlers running from debt or family obligation. In such a transient population, disappearances were tragically common. What made the Black Mountain cases notable was not necessarily their mysterious nature, but perhaps that anyone remembered them at all. Shay's research revealed that the documented disappearances clustered around periods of particular hardship, drought years when water sources failed, economic downturns when men took desperate risks to survive, periods of social unrest when criminals might seek refuge in the remotest possible locations. The mountain itself was undeniably dangerous. Its boulder maze created conditions where disorientation was not just possible but almost inevitable. Sound carried in strange ways throughout the granite passages, creating acoustic illusions that could confuse even experienced outdoorsmen. The massive stones absorbed the heat during the day and radiated it at night, creating thermal currents that could affect both weather patterns and human perception. The boulder formations also contain numerous deep crevices and hidden shafts where a fallen man might lie undiscovered indefinitely. The searchers of the 1870s and 1880s, working without modern equipment or systematic techniques, could have easily missed bodies that lay just metres from where they stood. It was rational, it was logical, it explained much. But did it explain everything? Today, Kalkajaka stands protected as a national park. It's 781 hectares and managed jointly by Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service and the traditional owners, the Eastern Kuku Yalanji people. Visitors can view the mountain from a safe observation platform, but access to the boulder maze itself is strictly prohibited. The signs at the park entrance cite practical safety concerns: unstable rocks, dangerous crevices, risks of disorientation. They make no mention of supernatural dangers or mysterious disappearances, yet the rangers, when asked directly, still recommend staying on the marked paths with an emphasis that suggests more than routine caution. Modern technology, too, has revealed some of the mountain secrets, though perhaps not all of them. Geological surveys have mapped the underground structure to some degree, revealing a complex network of passages and chambers that extends deep beneath the granite boulders. The formation is genuinely labyrinthine, with passages that interconnect in ways that would confuse even experienced cavers. Thermal imaging has confirmed the temperature variations early explorers reported. The interior of the boulder maze does remain consistently cooler than the surrounding landscape, creating microclimates that support unique ecosystem. The mountain is also home to 3 species found nowhere else on Earth, adapted to the specific conditions created by its granite environment. What these scientific researchers have found is an extraordinary example of how geological information can create conditions that challenge human perception and navigation. The acoustic properties that early visitors found so disturbing have explanations rooted in physics and geology. The sense of disorientation that affected even experienced bushmen results from the interaction of thermal currents, magnetic deposits in the granite, and the maze-like structure that makes linear navigation nearly impossible. Yet those lingering questions remain. Why do aircraft still occasionally report unusual effects when flying over the mountain? Why do some visitors continue to experience the profound disorientation that claimed lives more than a century ago? And why do even modern search and rescue teams approach the mountain with particular caution? Perhaps the traditional owners understood something that Western science is still learning to recognise: that some places operate according to principles that resist easy categorisation, where the intersection of geology, climate and human psychology creates effects that cannot be fully explained by examining each element in isolation. The transformation of Kalkajaka from a genuinely dangerous location into Australia's most supernatural mystery reveals something important about how folklore develops. But it also demonstrates how persistent some phenomena can be, even when subjected to thorough rational analysis. Bev Shay's thorough research provides compelling explanations for many of the documented disappearances. The harsh frontier conditions, the transient population, the dangerous terrain, all of these factors combine to create circumstances where men could vanish without supernatural intervention. Her work has helped to separate some documented fact from accumulated folklore, showing how ordinary tragedies become extraordinary legends. Yet her research, as thorough as it is, focuses primarily on the historical and social context of the disappearances. It addresses why men might have died in this region during the 1870s and 1880s, but it doesn't fully explain some of the more persistent phenomena reported by visitors, both historical and contemporary. The boulder maze's ability to confuse and disorient visitors is certainly real, and much of it can be explained by natural phenomena. But the consistency of the reports, spanning more than a century and coming from people with vastly different backgrounds and expectations, suggests that the mountain's effects on human perception may be more profound than simple environmental factors would predict. George Hawkins' safety rope ending abruptly in an empty chamber with no trace of the man who carefully laid it out remains one of the case's most puzzling elements. Modern understanding of the mountain structure doesn't fully explain how an experienced bushman could simply vanish from the end of his own marked trail. Perhaps, most significantly, the mountain's reputation continues to affect visitors today, despite the protection of national park status and the availability of modern safety equipment. As twilight settles over the Queensland landscape and the granite boulders of Kalkajaka fade into the darkness, I find myself thinking about the limits of explanation. Here is a location where documented research has provided rational context for historical tragedies, yet questions persist that resist easy resolution. Bev Shay's investigation has shown us that frontier conditions of 19th century Cape York Peninsula were brutal enough to explain most of the documented disappearances without invoking supernatural forces. Men died far from their home because the landscape was genuinely hostile, because help was days or weeks away, because a single mistake could, and often did, prove fatal. But her research reminds us that not every mystery yields completely to rational analysis. The Kuku Yalanji people who called it the place of the spear understood something fundamental about this location that perhaps transcends the purely physical. They recognised it as a place where the ordinary rules of existence operate differently, where respectful distance is the wisest approach. This mountain keeps its secrets. The men who vanished in its boulder maze joined the landscape itself, becoming part of a story that bridges documented history and enduring mystery. Strewth. Sometimes the most honest answer is that we still don't know everything. Thanks for joining me on this journey to Kalkajaka. Next time on Strewth, we'll be exploring the case of the Somerton Man, an unidentified body found on an Adelaide beach in 1948, carrying a secret code that puzzled investigators for more than 70 years. And just when it seemed like the mystery was solved recently through DNA identification, new questions have emerged that make this cold case stranger than ever. Until then, remember that the most enduring mysteries are often those that resist complete explanation, existing in the spaces between what we can document and what we can fully understand. The unknown doesn't require supernatural explanation, but neither does rational analysis always provide complete answers. If you like the show, make sure you share it with a friend, give us a rating, all that sort of stuff that really helps out a fledgling independent podcast. It's been a pleasure bringing you these stories, and with more listeners, just helps me to keep doing so. Thanks for listening.